Mr. President, one of the aims of American foreign aid is to assist countries in times of need. This spirit exemplifies a trait Americans and Utahns rightfully value, that of giving to those in need. And yet, for many years, our foreign aid dollars in support of abortion have been used to impose violent cultural imperialism. Instead of helping to preserve, strengthen, and sustain the lives of women and children abroad, our taxpayer dollars have been used to harm women's lives and to end the lives of their unborn children, especially baby girls. In some of these countries, girls are disproportionately aborted precisely because they are female. U.S. aid is used not to affirm the equal dignity of women, but to violently deny it. And in some of these countries, abortion is forced on women who don't even want abortions. Women in countries like Vietnam and Peru, for instance, who are forced to endure the coercive abortion and sterilization campaigns of the 1990s, just to name a couple of examples. Mr. President, what kind of aid does violence to women and girls? What kind of help is it to impose U.S. abortion extremism on countries that culturally and democratically reject it, or contribute to international organizations that allow regimes to use abortion as a tool of oppression? And what kind of progress is it to encourage sex-selective abortion and the denigration of human dignity for both the baby and the mother? U.S. advocacy abroad for the taking of an innocent unborn life is not pro-woman, it's not pro-child, and it's not pro-healthcare. It's pro-sexism, it's pro-violence, and we must end it. According to recent polling, the American people overwhelmingly agree. Nearly 60% of Americans oppose using tax dollars to pay for abortions. And more than 75% of Americans oppose using tax dollars to support abortions in other countries. Thankfully, President Ronald Reagan took steps to reverse this support starting in 1984, instituting the Mexico City policy to prohibit foreign aid from going to organizations that provide or promote abortions or that advocate to change abortion laws in a foreign country. Since then, the policy has unfortunately been rescinded and reinstated again and again, repeating this cycle between changing administrations. Another policy that used to have lasting support is the Hyde Amendment. This legal provision prohibited the use of federal funds to pay for abortion, with a set of exceptions. Recently, Democrats have abandoned this bipartisan position and have placed the Hyde Amendment under threat. It, too, could become a back-and-forth ping-pong policy, depending on who holds majorities within the two houses of Congress. Mr. President, the lives of babies and the dignity of women and girls are not political footballs. Women and unborn children everywhere have immeasurable dignity and eternal worth, regardless of where they're from. And they're entitled to the right to life and protection from harm, regardless of who happens to be in office from one moment to the next. The Protecting Life in Foreign Assistance Act affirms this truth. This bill would permanently stop the use of our foreign aid money from funding or promoting abortions overseas. In our laws and through our lives, we must uphold the dignity of each and every human person, regardless of race, regardless of sex, regardless of appearance, abilities, or age. The measure before us today does just that, and I urge my colleagues to support it. The lives of millions of women and children, born and unborn, depend on it. And so, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Foreign Relations be discharged from further consideration of S. 137. and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reserving the right to object, my colleague and friend from Utah and I agree on a couple of points. Yes, President Biden did rescind the global gag rule, which this proposal would not only reestablish but make permanent and expand disastrously. And yes, women and children should not be political footballs, nor should this issue be one. And unfortunately, that's the objective of this proposal. It's difficult to exaggerate the breadth of this proposed legislation or the breadth of harm that the global gag rule does. In fact, it prohibits foreign organizations receiving United States assistance from providing legal abortion services or referrals or even information on abortion services, even when those activities are funded without any connection to the United States government monies. And it egregiously blocks organizations receiving United States funds from advocating for abortion legislation, the mere advocacy, stifling their ability to champion their patients, even if that advocacy is not funded in any way by United States taxpayers. This legislation would not only codify this dangerous policy, but expand it even beyond what was implemented under previous administrations, expanding it, not just codifying it. Thankfully, President Biden has rescinded this policy. It was an important effort to restore United States leadership abroad, promoting healthcare access in places it's needed most. It was a critical step in what is now needed, a critical step toward what is now needed, permanent prohibition of the global gag rule, not codification of its expansion. Let's be very clear. The global gag rule does nothing to protect the health of people around the world. It blocks health care access, it stifles local advocacy efforts, and it undermines reproductive rights worldwide, putting in jeopardy the people who need those services most. It impedes access to a range of health services, including contraception, HIV prevention and treatment, and maternal and child care, because it cuts off funding for many of the most experienced healthcare providers. Some proponents of this dangerous policy seem to claim it will reduce abortions, or it's intended to do so, but studies have shown, in fact, it just does the opposite. And the global gag rule actually increases rates of abortion, many of them unsafe, because it reduces access to contraceptives and it increases the number of unintended pregnancies. In short, we should be joining other countries in addressing global goals like creating an AIDS-free generation, ending preventable maternal and child deaths, and achieving universal access to sexual and reproductive health care, not putting unnecessary restrictions on U.S. funds that cause fear and impede access to health care. Unfortunately, that's what the global gag rule and this legislation do, impeding countries' efforts to improve global health, advance human rights, and achieve gender equality. I oppose the Lee bill. I urge my colleagues to come together and work instead to promote global health, and therefore I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, I have tremendous respect for my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Connecticut. He and I both acknowledge the The policy that we're arguing over, the nature of the policy, is one in which we've seen something of a tug of war, a ping-pong match over the years. The Republican administration will put in place or restore the so-called Mexico City policy, prohibiting U.S. foreign aid from going to organizations that perform or advocate for abortion overseas. It's backed by an estimated 75% of Americans who don't believe that we should be using U.S. taxpayer dollars, especially to further the cause of conducting or advocating for abortions overseas. He and I both agree that President Biden has rescinded that. I think where we disagree can be highlighted and traced back to the fact that we call it by different names. He refers to this as the gag rule. A gag rule. Now, normally we think of a gag rule, we think of something that tells someone who is otherwise free to speak that they may not speak. That is, in fact, what happens when we don't allow people to live. It is what happens to all these baby girls who were never allowed to be born precisely because they are female. And make no mistake, when we fund abortions overseas, that is what's happening. That happens a lot in countries that receive our aid in the absence of the Mexico City policy. Some of that goes to these organizations that perform abortions. And in many of these countries, sex-selective abortions are not only tolerated culturally, they're commonplace. They're excessive. As a result, these baby girls never get to be born. They never get to become women. They never get to speak in the first place. That's a form of gagging them. That's not okay. Regardless of how you feel about abortion, regardless of whether you think that's a baby, a human life, or whether you think it's something else, I'm not sure what else it could be. When someone becomes pregnant, we know that is the potential of what will one day be a human being, absent a death, whether a natural death or a death brought about by someone's actions or by the operation of a disease or medical condition or surgical intervention in the case of abortion. It is a person. We shouldn't lose sight of that. Now, I have difficulty accepting the premise that the only solution to this is continuing to fund organizations that perform or advocate for abortions overseas. I reject the premise that anything we do in this area to withhold those funds will necessarily result in more abortions. As far as the suggestion that organizations could receive these funds and still perform abortions and that not translate into U.S. dollars being used to perform abortions, I reject that premise as well, for the same reason that I reject the premise that Planned Parenthood isn't using taxpayer dollars to perform abortions. It is. It's spent differently. This is a matter of accounting, but it sustains and supports an organization that itself advocates for and performs many abortions. These are, in fact, human lives. And the American people are, in fact, very uncomfortable with the idea that we're funding abortions with their taxpayer dollars, and we're doing it overseas. We shouldn't do that. This shouldn't be controversial. I look forward to the day when it's not. Thank you.
The senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Just to be clear, I understand my colleagues' points, but I think I have highlighted, and I want to emphasize again, the limited purposes for which American taxpayers' dollars are used. And the advocacy, the health care, the contraception, HIV screening and treatment, world health would be prevented by this legislation. I think that's an unintended consequence, maybe it's unintended, that is gargantuan in its potential impact, and therefore I continue my objection. Thank you.